Before sunrise in Beaumont, Texas, the calm of a quiet residential street was broken by the low growl of armored engines moving into position. Tactical vehicles rolled in without sirens, while SWAT officers and narcotics units stepped out with purpose, forming tight lines along sidewalks that only minutes earlier had been empty and still. Search warrants were executed at the same moment, doors were forced open, and the first suspects were pulled into the cold, morning air as neighbors watched from behind curtains. This was not a routine arrest or a random drug stop, and the scale of the response made that clear from the first second. Multiple agencies were involved, equipment usually reserved for high-risk raids was deployed, and officers moved as if they were closing in on something far larger than a single house or a single dealer. The operation unfolded with speed and silence, suggesting months of preparation behind what appeared to be a sudden strike. But this was only the surface of what led police into this neighborhood. What looked like an isolated raid was tied to a deeper, organized crime structure that had quietly operated for years. How long can a drug network hide in plain sight before the pressure finally breaks it open? The result came first, and it was impossible to ignore, because the operation ended with multiple suspects in custody before the sun had fully risen over Beaumont. Police units secured the area within minutes, and several individuals were detained at different locations linked to the same operation, showing that this was not a single arrest, but a coordinated strike against a connected group. Officers escorted suspects out of houses and vehicles, while evidence teams moved in immediately to control and document everything left behind. The speed of these arrests sent a clear message that the targets were already identified long before the doors were opened. Authorities confirmed that those taken into custody faced serious charges tied to organized criminal activity, with drug trafficking at the center of the case. Investigators described the group as more than street-level dealers, because the seized materials pointed to a system built for distribution rather than personal use. Bags of narcotics were recovered along with tools used to measure, package, and move drugs across the city, indicating a steady operation that depended on routine and discipline. This was the kind of setup that allows illegal products to move quietly through neighborhoods without drawing attention until the moment everything collapses. The amount of evidence recovered during the raid reinforced the seriousness of the charges and helped explain why the police response was so heavy. Drugs ready for sale were found alongside cash believed to be proceeds from recent transactions, and officers also seized items used to coordinate deliveries and protect the operation from interference. Each reminder of planning and structure suggested that this group had been operating for a long time, relying on predictable patterns and trusted roles to keep the business running. Nothing about the scene suggested panic or improvisation before the raid, which only made the sudden arrests more striking. What stood out most was how controlled the situation remained, despite the number of suspects involved. There were no chaotic chases through the neighborhood and no open confrontation in the streets, because officers moved with precision and timing that prevented escape. Tactical teams sealed off access points, while arrest teams moved in quickly, leaving suspects with no clear path. The absence of gunfire did not reduce the intensity of the operation, since the threat of violence was managed before it could appear, reflecting a strategy designed to overwhelm the network through speed and coordination. Officials emphasized that these results were not the outcome of a sudden tip or a single lucky break, but the final stage of a long and patient investigation. For months, and possibly longer, investigators had tracked movements, communications, and routines connected to the group, building a picture of how the network functioned on a daily basis. Each arrest reflected a decision made earlier in the investigation, showing that the operation was carefully timed to secure as many suspects and as much evidence as possible in one coordinated moment. This approach allowed police to disrupt the organization at multiple levels at once, rather than allowing it to adjust or regroup after a limited arrest. By striking several linked locations at the same time, officers prevented warnings from spreading and stopped suspects from destroying evidence or fleeing the area. The result was a clean collapse of local operations, where the group lost people, product, and control in a single morning. Such outcomes are rare without extended preparation and cooperation between specialized units. For residents of Beaumont, the sight of multiple arrests in familiar streets was a sharp reminder that organized crime does not always announce itself through daily violence. These operations often exist quietly, blending into normal routines until law enforcement decides to act. The scale of this crackdown made it clear that police were not reacting to a short-term spike in crime, but closing a case that had been building beneath the surface for a long time. The results were visible in handcuffs and evidence bags, but the work behind them remained mostly unseen. With the outcome now clear, attention turns to the methods that allowed investigators to uncover and dismantle this network in the first place, because the path to these arrests reveals how modern drug operations are identified and taken down. Beaumont did not become a target by accident, because the investigation began with small signals that slowly grew into a clear pattern for local police. Residents in several quiet streets reported the same concerns again and again, including short visits at odd hours, unfamiliar cars stopping briefly, and people entering a single house only to leave minutes later. None of these details alone suggested a major crime, but together they formed the first outline of a distribution point hiding in plain sight. Officers logged these complaints and began watching without drawing attention, allowing daily life in the neighborhood to continue unchanged. As weeks passed, those observations began to align with earlier arrests made in other parts of the city. In separate cases, suspects detained for minor drug offenses mentioned similar locations and routines, even though they did not appear connected on the surface. Investigators noticed that several of these individuals moved through the same residential areas and followed the same timing patterns, which suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Each small arrest added another piece to a larger picture that was still incomplete, but becoming harder to ignore. Police soon realized that the group was using ordinary homes as distribution points, a method designed to avoid attention and reduce risk. Drugs were not stored in large quantities at any one place, and no signs marked these houses as illegal operations. From the outside, they looked like any other family residence, complete with parked cars and trimmed yards. Inside, however, narcotics were prepared, divided, and sent out through trusted runners who blended easily into the neighborhood. This approach reflects a familiar model seen across the United States, where organized crime favors patience over force. Rather than relying on violence to control territory, these networks depend on routine and silence, using time as their strongest defense. By avoiding conflict and limiting exposure, they can operate for months or even years before law enforcement builds enough evidence to act. Beaumont followed this pattern closely, showing how domestic drug operations adapt to pressure without changing their core purpose. Investigators also noted that the individuals involved did not present themselves as members of a large or visible gang. There were no colors, no public displays of power, and no obvious leaders drawing attention. Instead, roles were simple and replaceable, which made the group harder to map and easier to rebuild if one part failed. This structure allowed the operation to survive earlier arrests without collapsing, since losses were absorbed quietly and quickly. Over time, surveillance confirmed that the same houses remained active despite changes in personnel. This consistency showed that the locations mattered more than the people passing through them, and it pointed investigators toward a system rather than a loose collection of offenders. Police documented movement patterns, delivery schedules, and repeated contacts, slowly transforming community concerns into solid evidence. The process required restraint and discipline, since acting too early could have warned the network and erased months of work. By the time the final operation was approved, Beaumont had already revealed why it had become a hotspot. Its residential layout provided cover, while steady demand created a stable market that rewarded low-profile distribution. The case demonstrated that organized crime does not need large gangs or open violence to succeed. only enough time and anonymity to settle in. Understanding how this network took root is essential to understanding how investigators prepared for what came next when observation gave way to direct action. The operation moved from planning to action before most of Beaumont was awake, because speed was the only advantage officers could not afford to lose. Local police units, SWAT teams, and narcotics investigators gathered at a staging area outside the neighborhood, reviewing assignments one last time while engines idled quietly. Each group knew its role, and each officer understood that hesitation could give suspects time to flee or destroy evidence. This was the tactical peak of an investigation that had taken months to prepare. Search warrants had been approved in advance, based on carefully collected evidence that linked several locations to the same network. Officers carried printed layouts of houses and surrounding streets, marking entry points and possible exits. The goal was simple but demanding, which was to hit every target at once and remove control from the suspects in the first seconds. When the signal was given, teams moved together, spreading through the neighborhood with discipline and focus. At the first locations, doors were breached quickly, and suspects were secured before confusion could turn into resistance. Officers moved through rooms methodically, calling out positions and checking corners to prevent surprise attacks. Individuals found inside were ordered to the ground and restrained, limiting their ability to reach phones, containers, or hidden spaces. The controlled pace inside the houses contrasted sharply with the urgency of the overall operation, showing how training turns chaos into order. Outside, perimeter units blocked streets and monitored movement, ensuring that no one slipped away during the arrests. Vehicles connected to the suspects were stopped and searched, cutting off escape routes that might have been planned in advance. The coordination between inside and outside teams reflected a shared understanding that evidence and people were equally important targets. Losing either could weaken the case built over months of work. Evidence teams followed closely behind arrest units, entering only after suspects were secured. Their task was to locate drugs, cash, and tools linked to distribution before anything could be hidden or destroyed. Officers photographed rooms, collected packaging materials, and documented the placement of items to preserve the story each location told. This careful process protected the integrity of the case and ensured that the results would stand up under scrutiny. Throughout the operation, communication remained constant and clear. Team leaders reported progress in short updates, adjusting movements as needed to keep the pace tight. This flow of information allowed commanders to respond to unexpected details without slowing the mission. The emphasis on coordination reduced risk for officers and prevented gaps that suspects could exploit. The choice to prioritize speed was deliberate, because delay favors those who know the terrain. By acting quickly, police denied suspects the chance to warn each other or destroy records. Phones were secured early, and digital devices were placed in evidence bags before messages could be erased. Every second gained in those early moments translated into stronger control over the scene. Despite the intensity, the operation avoided unnecessary confrontation. Officers relied on overwhelming presence rather than force, removing the need for prolonged struggles. This approach protected both law enforcement and the surrounding community, reducing the chance of stray violence in residential streets. The absence of gunfire did not lessen the seriousness of the action, because the threat had been neutralized through planning rather than reaction. The arrests unfolded with precision, reflecting lessons learned from previous operations across the country. Drug networks often expect slow responses or limited enforcement, and this raid shattered that expectation. Suspects were removed before they could understand what was happening, leaving no room for coordination or resistance. The balance between urgency and control defined the success of the mission. As the final locations were cleared, officers secured evidence and transported suspects for processing. The neighborhood returned to quiet, but the impact of the operation remained visible in sealed doors and marked vehicles. The coordinated strike showed how preparation and teamwork can dismantle organized crime without turning streets into battlefields. If you were the commander on scene, would you prioritize arresting suspects first, or securing evidence before anything else. With the raid complete, attention now shifts to the immediate consequences of this operation and how the arrest will reshape criminal activity in Beaumont and beyond. Organized criminal activity in Texas is defined not by chaos, but by structure, and this case in Beaumont showed how the law views such operations as coordinated systems rather than random crimes. Under Texas law, an organized criminal group is a set of individuals who work together with shared roles and goals, even if they rarely meet or openly identify as a gang. The focus is on cooperation over time, planning, and profit, which separates these cases from simple possession or isolated sales. In Beaumont, the arrests reflected that legal definition because the suspects were tied together by function and purpose rather than by appearance or reputation. At the center of this kind of operation is role division, which allows the network to survive pressure without drawing attention. Some individuals are responsible for holding drugs at temporary locations, often moving supplies before any one place becomes too risky. Others handle distribution, using short routes and quick exchanges that limit exposure. Another group focuses on collecting money and managing payments, keeping cash flow separate from the physical product to reduce losses during arrests. This separation of tasks creates a system that continues working even when parts are disrupted. Violence is not the engine of these networks, and that is what makes them difficult to detect. Unlike street gangs that rely on fear and territory, organized drug groups often avoid conflict entirely, choosing silence and routine instead. They understand that public violence attracts attention and invites aggressive enforcement. By staying invisible and blending into normal neighborhoods, they reduce risk while expanding reach. This quiet approach does not make them harmless, because the damage caused by steady drug distribution spreads slowly through communities. The danger of such operations lies in their patience and adaptability. When one person is arrested, another can take the role with little disruption. When a location becomes known, operations shift to a new address. This flexibility allows networks to absorb losses and continue, sometimes for years, before law enforcement gathers enough evidence to strike. The Beaumont case illustrated this pattern, as the same methods had protected the group through earlier enforcement actions elsewhere in the city. Across the United States, similar models have appeared in cities large and small, from suburban neighborhoods to rural towns. Organized drug networks no longer depend on visible gangs or centralized leadership. Instead, they function like supply chains, moving product through layers of handlers who may not understand the full scope of the operation. This design limits the damage caused by arrests and makes investigations slower and more complex. Beaumont fit neatly into this national pattern, showing that no area is too small or quiet to attract organized crime. What separates these groups from street-level dealers is scale and intent. Street dealers often act independently and react emotionally to pressure, while organized networks operate with planning and restraint. Decisions are made based on risk assessment rather than impulse. Locations are chosen for cover rather than convenience. This disciplined approach allows operations to grow quietly while avoiding the attention that follows open conflict. Texas law treats these cases seriously because the harm extends beyond individual transactions. Organized criminal activity creates long-term distribution routes that feed addiction and undermine public safety. The legal framework allows prosecutors to address the system as a whole, rather than chasing individuals one by one. In Beaumont, this meant focusing on how roles connected and how the network functioned as a unit. Understanding this structure changes how the operation is viewed. The arrests were not simply about drugs found in homes or cars, but about disrupting an underground logistics chain that had been moving product efficiently and quietly. These were not street crimes driven by anger or desperation. They were calculated actions built on planning and coordination. This case reinforced a clear message for law enforcement and communities alike, which is that organized crime does not need violence to be powerful. It only needs time discipline, and enough silence to operate unseen. As this hidden system is pulled into the open, the next focus shifts to the immediate impact of removing it and how the absence of this network will affect crime patterns in Beaumont. The crackdown in Beaumont matters far beyond the city limits, because cases like this are now viewed by authorities as threats to domestic security rather than simple criminal problems. Drug networks that operate quietly inside residential areas undermine public safety over time, even when they avoid open violence. Officials see these groups as systems that weaken communities, strain law enforcement resources, and create long-term instability. This perspective explains why responses are often forceful and coordinated, treating organized crime as a challenge to national order. Drug trafficking is closely linked to violence, even when weapons are not present at every stage of an operation. The distribution of narcotics fuels addiction, and addiction drives theft, assault, and desperation across neighborhoods. Organized crime also relies on intimidation within its own ranks, which can escalate into violence when control is threatened. These effects spread outward, touching people who may never see the original dealers, but feel the consequences in daily life. Another reason authorities take these cases seriously is the way criminal networks adapt after arrests. Removing one group does not end the demand for drugs, and it does not erase the roots and methods already in place. History shows that when a local operation is dismantled, others often move quickly to fill the gap. This cycle forces law enforcement to think beyond individual raids and focus on sustained pressure across regions. The Beaumont case highlights this reality clearly. While one network was disrupted, investigators remain aware that suppliers, partners, and competitors still exist elsewhere. Some may already be testing the boundaries left behind, watching to see how quickly law enforcement attention fades. This is why officials rarely describe such operations as final victories, choosing instead to frame them as necessary steps in an ongoing effort. Investigations connected to organized crime rarely end with the last arrest at a single scene. Evidence collected during raids often leads to new names, locations, and financial trails that extend far beyond the original targets. Phones, records, and seized cash can reveal connections to other cities or even other states. Each piece of information creates opportunities to expand cases and disrupt additional layers of the network. From a security standpoint, the concern is not only about drugs, but about the systems that allow illegal markets to function. Organized crime depends on transportation, communication, and financial movement, all of which overlap with legitimate infrastructure. When these systems are exploited, they create vulnerabilities that can be used by other criminal groups. Authorities warn that ignoring these patterns allows underground logistics to grow stronger and more efficient. Communities often underestimate these threats because the most visible signs appear slowly. There may be no sudden surge in violence, and daily routines continue without obvious disruption. Over time, however, the effects accumulate in the form of addiction, lost productivity, and rising costs for public services. By the time the damage becomes visible, networks may already be deeply rooted. The broader warning from Beaumont is that dismantling one operation does not end the struggle. Law enforcement must maintain pressure, share information, and adapt strategies as criminal groups change their methods. Public awareness also plays a role, since early reporting and cooperation can shorten the lifespan of hidden operations. Without these efforts, networks can reappear under new names and locations. This is why officials stress that the Beaumont case is part of a larger picture, not an isolated incident. It reflects a national challenge that requires patience and persistence rather than quick conclusions. And this is why the story of Beaumont does not end in Beaumont, but continues wherever organized crime seeks its next opening. The story of Beaumont began on quiet streets, where nothing seemed out of place, but it ended with handcuffs, sealed doors, and a clear warning about what can grow unnoticed inside ordinary neighborhoods. What unfolded moved in a steady line, from early community concerns to patient investigation, then to a fast and controlled raid that removed an organized drug operation in a single morning. Each stage mattered, and each step showed how hidden systems can survive for years before law enforcement closes in. This case also highlights the critical role of local police in the broader fight against narcotics. While federal agencies often receive attention, it is local officers who hear the first complaints, track daily patterns, and stay present long after headlines fade. Their work forms the foundation of any successful crackdown, especially in cities where organized crime relies on silence rather than violence. The question now is whether Beaumont is only a small hotspot or a signal of a wider push across Texas to expose similar networks operating under the radar. Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us how serious you believe the domestic drug threat has become in America. And if you want to follow more stories like this, subscribe to Military Power so you do not miss the next operation.